Hi everyone, and welcome to this presentation on an introduction to policy analysis. This is part one of 6 videos that will cover information for week 6, 7, and 8. The information for all the videos is from Gilbert and Terrell's book that is assigned Reading Dimensions of Social Welfare Policy. So let's go over some approaches to policy analysis. Gilbert and Terrell go over 3 approaches to policy analysis that they refer to as the 3 Ps. The first one of these Ps involves process. So it is an analysis of the process of how the policy was created. So the focus is on policy making, also known as policy formulation. Process analyses consider social, political, and historical factors that guided the decision-making process of how the policy was created. Policy analysis that involves analysis of process is concerned with how interactions among political, governmental, and interest groups, as well as the citizenry, affect decision making. So some things to consider would be where the policy's ideas came from in the first place. Was this something that was a grassroots effort from the public, or does this come from higher up in terms of some sort of legislative body, etc.? And also how those different groups interact. Like, for example, was there any interaction between the legislative makers of the policy and the public that will be affected by the policy? There are different approaches, theories, and perspectives to understand the process of how the policy came to be. So many of these are actually in your Day and Shield, A New History of Social Welfare textbook, where we reviewed conflict theory, feminism, intersectional feminism, socialism. All those different macro practice theories can be used to understand how this policy came to be. And lastly, when it comes to process studies or process analyses, the actual analysis can involve an individual policy, or it can involve an entire system. But in any case, it is focused on understanding all the factors that went into creating this policy, not how it was actually implemented or what have you, but just the creation process, the policy making process. Okay, so now let's move on to the second P in terms of a product analysis. This type of policy analysis focuses on analyzing the choices that were made with regard to the components of the policy. Gilbert and Terrell focus on 4 choices in their policy framework. These are the basis of social allocations, the nature of the social provisions, the delivery system for those social provisions, and the mode of finance. I'll go over each one of these briefly later on in this video, and then there's going to be separate videos for each one of these, which then means that there are 5 videos, not 6. Okay, so the Gilbert and Terrell framework with regard to these 4 dimensions is interested in understanding the values, theories, and assumptions that underlie the choices that were made. In addition, the framework also considers all the different options that are no longer available in terms of the choices that were made because of those choices. So once a decision is made about, for example, who the policy is going to serve, which is that number 1, the basis of social allocations, who is going to benefit from the policy. Once that decision is made, then other options for other beneficiaries are no longer available. Okay, the third P is performance. Performance analysis is interested in evaluating outcomes. So there has to be some data collection, quantitative and qualitative usually, to understand the outcomes of the policy. So the questions of concern are, number one, how well were the programs that are that usually come from policies, how well were they implemented? Number two, what was the impact of the policies in a variety of areas? What was the impact on clients, the public, etc. And then ultimately, number three, did the policy accomplish its goals? So what did it say it was going to do, and did it actually do those things? So when it comes to the first question about how well the programs were implemented, this is all about efficiency. Whereas with number two, in terms of the impact, that's about the effects of the program. And then number three is about the effectiveness of the program. So you have 3 P's and 3 E's. I'm not going to go there. Okay, so anyways, Gilbert and Terrell's framework focuses on the product approach in terms of policy analysis. And your paper guideline that you see has their framework in the guidelines that you guys will be using. But there are also certain key elements in any well-designed policy analysis framework that we also incorporated into your paper guideline. And these are adapted from a handout that I received back when I was in my graduate program from one of my professors. So here we go. The policy analysis has to systematically analyze that social policy and or any program that comes from it. The systematically part means that it's in a certain order, just like with research, there are certain procedures that are followed in certain orders, etc. The policy analysis reflects an understanding that social policy is context sensitive, and policy options usually contain a set of competing priorities. So if you look at your policy analysis guideline, you'll see that we ask about what the views are of the problem and of the people who will benefit. There's also the analysis about values and competing priorities based on competing values. A well-designed policy analysis framework also employs rational methods for inquiry and analysis. The idea of rational means that there's reasoning behind it and that it makes sense. The framework must also examine the potential impact of a policy on other social policies, social problems, and the public. The framework also takes into account the unintended consequences of that policy, and it examines the policy in the context of alternative uses for the resources allocated to that policy. So in terms of the 3 P's, the process, product, and performance, when we look at these first two in terms of systematically analyzing the policy and reflecting the understanding that the policy is context sensitive, etc., we can see that this is the product piece of the Gilbert and Terrell framework. So these are those 4 questions. So now I'd like to go over what these questions are asking about in a little bit more detail. So let's take the first one in terms of what are the bases of social allocations. This question is really asking who is going to benefit from the policy or any program that comes from that policy. So this is a question of who is actually going to be the client. In order to determine that who, there have to be some sort of eligibility criteria that then determine who the who is going to be. Okay, so this first one is about the who, the people who will benefit, and then any rules that get to decide who is benefiting and then therefore who is not benefiting. The second question in terms of social provisions is asking about what those benefits are going to be that the who's get. So once we know we have the idea of who is going to benefit, then we ask, okay, well, what are they going to get? What sort of services or monies, or what are they going to get? So typically, the choices involve providing cash or some sort of in-kind benefit. So this could be vouchers, this could be services, etc. For number 3, in terms of the strategies for the delivery of those provisions, this is really asking, okay, how are those benefits going to be given to the clients, the beneficiary? So we have the who in terms of the clients, we have the what in terms of what they're going to get, and then now number 3 is asking, how are we going to get those services, that cash, etc., to the clients? And there are a wide variety of options here. There are many choices, because remember, these are dimensions of choice. And when it comes to number 3, for example, there are a lot of choices. And when I go over this in its own video, you'll see what I mean. Okay, as far as number 4, in terms of the financing, this is asking, okay, where will the funding come from? And how, so there's 2 hows here, how will it get from that source of funding to the deliverer of the benefits, who will then give it in some form to the client? So, for example, is this coming from federal government sources? Is it coming from the state? Is it coming from a private foundation? And then once the source has been identified, how is it going to go from that source to, let's say, a government agency or a nonprofit? Via what kind of contract, etc. So we'll be like I said, I keep saying it, I know, that I'll be going over each one of these in more detail. But for now, just kind of know that the product piece is in your guideline. So with the Gilbert and Terrell framework, we have these 4 dimensions of choice. And in using these 4 dimensions to analyze a policy, there are 3 axes to consider. The first involves the range of choices within each dimension. The second involves the social values that underlie or support each of those choices. And then the third involves the theories and assumptions that also underlie each of those alternatives. Because again, remember, it's all about these choices. So the first in terms of understanding all the different alternatives and choices that are possible with each dimension, that I'm going to go over in the 4 individual videos. For the rest of this video, I'm going to focus on the social values and the theories and assumptions. Okay, axis 2, social values. There are many values that go into all the different choices that are made along those 4 dimensions. But there are 3 core values that must be considered. The first is equality, and we've already gone over equality and equity, etc., in terms of social justice. For the purposes of the Gilbert and Terrell framework, they're considering the numerical aspect of equality, which is the idea to treat everyone the same, or as they say, to all an equal share. This is different than proportional equality, which is giving the same treatment to similar persons. So this is more of a meritarian view of justice. And not a pop quiz or anything, but when we were going over the theories of justice, which theorists' views reflect the meritarian view of justice? I'll give you a second to think about it. I know you're like, oh my God, I don't know, I don't remember. We just had that test and I'm not thinking straight. The answer is Nozick. But anyways, so for Gilbert and Terrell, however, they're considering equality as the same, like everybody gets the same treatment, which is the egalitarian view of justice. Okay, then there's equity, which we did also go over, but here it's proportional equity. So we got to insert that word there in front of equity. So this is the idea of fair treatment in terms of getting what is deserved. And then the last core value is adequacy. And this is about acceptability in terms of providing a decent standard of material well-being. And a lot of times this adequacy piece comes in when we're considering the funding that involved. So is it adequate to accomplish the goals of the policy, for example? So these are the three core values, but as I said, there are many more. And some of the other values to consider involve privacy, which is the ability to control access to our personal information. Dignity is a big one for us as social workers, the idea of being worthy of honor and respect, and understanding how well the policy kind of supports the dignity of people, or is there shame and stigma that surround that policy. Of course, all of those American social values that we went over. I'm not going to go over them again in this video, even just a little bit, because I know we already did that, but here they are, just as a little reminder. And then there's other values even beyond all of those. Gilbert and Terrell review 4 kind of ranges of values, which I want to touch base on here. So for example, they talk about cost effectiveness in the sense of comparing costs to benefits and having the benefits outweigh those costs, where the benefits aren't necessarily calculated in terms of money, but in terms of the benefit to people. So for example, if it costs $10,000 for every preschooler to receive early childhood education that will prepare them to graduate, elementary school with a decent GPA, then is that $10,000 worth it? Or if it's going to cost $1 million for a child to achieve that benefit, is it worth it? That's the question of of cost effectiveness. But it also kind of leads to the idea of getting the least amount necessary in terms of cost to help those in need so as not to waste resources, which, makes sense and it seems logical and rational. But the problem with that is there's a lot of stigma and shame there for those receiving help. And as a selective policy, that means that there's going to be more bureaucracy for those providing the help. Why? Because there's going to be all these eligibility rules and criteria. And while those eligibility rules and criteria are trying to make sure that these limited resources go to those in most need, that also means that the people who are asking for help have to go through a lot in order to receive that help. And it's a process that can be very shaming to people, versus valuing social effectiveness over cost effectiveness, which is the idea of just providing benefits to everyone because everyone is an equal member of society. So this is based on the value that providing benefits to everyone will lead to benefits to society in the long term. For example, investing in preventative care costs more now in the immediate, but it saves money in the long term while also providing the maximum benefit to everyone in the public. And any policy that is based on social effectiveness is going to be one where there's no stigma or shame because everyone is receiving help. So it's a universal policy, which means that there's not going to be as many rules for eligibility, etc., because it's for everyone. So therefore, there's less bureaucracy and red tape. Now, I know in the Gilbert and Terrell textbook, they kind of put these values that I just went over, and then the 3 others that are coming, kind of on a continuum of conservative versus progressive, but it's not 100% accurate in reality. So I will go over that in a little bit more detail in class in terms of what I mean. So that's why you'll see that I've positioned the extremes of the 4 values along what in reality are conservative versus progressive perspective. So cost effectiveness would go more with a conservative belief system, whereas social effectiveness belongs more with a progressive perspective. Another value has to do with freedom of choice versus social control. So, what is freedom of choice? This involves the idea that the people who are receiving benefits can have a lot of choice in choosing the type of benefit. Although it's more like the people who are delivering the benefit, the agency or what have you, is given the freedom of choice by the policy, versus social control, where there's no individual choice except to take what is offered or not. So, for example, let's say we have somebody who is impoverished. So, for example, the policy could give clothing, it could give access to a food pantry, it could give bus vouchers, etc., versus the ultimate sort of benefit that involves freedom of choice, which is cash. So if we give a person cash in terms of, like public assistance that we have now, then the recipient of that benefit has the choice of how they want to spend that money. They can spend it on food or they can spend it on clothes based on what they need, versus if the policy is giving clothes and not giving food. So there's no choice there for the recipient. They have to take what's being given or they get nothing at all. So the value system behind this is whether or not the policy believes people have the ability to make good choices for themselves or not. So for us, that's really a question of the client's right to self-determination. Okay. Another value involves the value of efficiency versus the freedom of dissent. So efficiency is a more bureaucratic belief system that those receiving benefits should have no say in the planning and implementation and decision-making processes that affect them, because it would take a lot of time and energy and effort to give the beneficiaries, the clients, a say in all of these choices that are being made. And rather than do that, the idea is they have no voice in the process. Versus freedom of dissent, which is more democratic and believes that those receiving benefits have a say in the planning and implementation decision-making processes that affect them. So there's usually a body that is formed made up of community members, leaders, etc., that come together, and it's usually something like a community advisory council or some term like that involves the beneficiaries giving input into what will work for them. Then there's local autonomy versus centralization. So the local autonomy belief is that the federal or state government provides a block grant, which is a sum of money with a general purpose, like public assistance. And then localities are given discretion in how to design and implement those programs. Are they going to spend 20% on childcare services, or are they going to spend 50% on childcare services? It's up to them. Versus a more centralized approach where the federal or state government provides a grant under what's called a categorical system with very detailed and specific rules. And it's called categorical because there are people who fall under a certain category, like parents with children who are impoverished. Okay, that's a certain group of people, a certain category. So that's why they're called categorical. But the idea here is that the government is saying you need to provide services to those who are impoverished, and this is how you do it. You spend this money, 20% of it on childcare, 30% on cash grants, and et cetera, et cetera. It tells them exactly what they need to spend it on, versus local autonomy, which is, like I said, the states get to decide, or the localities get to decide how they want to spend that money. So those are the four continuums, if you will, of values that Gilbert and Terrell go over. And for the purposes of this video, everything on the left was more conservative approaches, and everything on the right is more progressive. Okay, the third axis involves theories and assumptions. And this really is about two main questions that, if you recall all the way back to the very first couple of weeks of classes, we kind of covered there. But here's a little bit more detail. Okay, the first question is, how is the problem viewed? In other words, what is believed to be the cause of the program? If people believe that the problem is an individual person's fault, like they did something wrong, they didn't work hard enough, etc., then the policy that comes from that belief is going to be residual. In other words, it's temporary. It selects only those most in need. So, all those eligibility criteria that I mentioned earlier. And it is only for emergency purposes, which is why it's temporary. So the idea here is that this is a situation that came up and the policy is going to help those folks, but only those folks, and only because it's an emergency situation. Versus if the problem is viewed as being society's fault, so viewing unemployment, for example, as having to do with a recession or a depression in the economy that is not the individual person's fault, then any policy that comes from this is going to be universal, which is kind of the opposite of residual, really, which is that it's always available and it's for everyone. So what is an example of this? Well, there's many, because like I said before, most of our social welfare policies are residual. So child welfare, public child welfare, it's based on the belief that there are certain faults and deficiencies in a family system that have led to that child abuse. So it's a residual policy in the sense that not everybody gets it. It's not a let's prevent abuse among all people. It's once abuse has taken place, this is what we're going to do about it. So it's selective, temporary. We're not going to be supporting this family forever because we view this as a crisis situation. Versus a universal policy like unemployment insurance, which is always available if needed, and it's for everyone, because the idea is that there's going to be dips in the economy, and therefore we should help people when they're unemployed. The second question in this axis, in terms of theories and assumptions, is how are the beneficiaries viewed? So the people that the policy is going to help. What is our belief about them? What do we think about them? Well, if we think that they are undeserving of help because they should be doing this on, getting through this crisis on their own, or that they are lazy, etc. You can think of all of the negative terminology there. Then again, we're going to have a residual policy, which, just by way of reminder, is temporary, selective, and viewed as responding to some sort of crisis. Versus if we believe that people are deserving, because they're working hard, etc., then it's going to be a universal policy that we design, which is always available and for everybody. Okay, so those are the two main questions that involve our assumptions and our beliefs about the causes of why something is happening. So our theories about why something is happening. And they determine in part what the policies will be. So just sort of keep all this in mind when you're watching the 4 videos that come next. So here are there's the one reference, and then the sources of the images that I used. And this is actually not the end. As I said, there are going to be 4 videos, so please make sure to pop over there, and thank you.